Welcome, everyone. We're just going to give folks another 30 seconds to filter in, and then we'll get started. Great. We're going to go ahead and get started. It looks like we have a critical mass of attendees out there and lots to cover. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Andrew Logan. I direct the oil and gas program here at Ceres. And I'm very excited to welcome you all to this webinar, which will cover the highlights of our third annual report, benchmarking the greenhouse gas emissions of onshore oil and gas production in the US. If you're here on this webinar, you probably know that methane has become an increasingly critical area for investors and for policymakers. And the analysis that you're going to hear about today, helps explain why that is. As you'll hear from Lesley and Luke, there is tremendous variability in emissions between producers and particularly between the top and bottom quartile performance bands. And that means that, for many companies, there's considerable room for improvement in their performance, and even just bringing, everyone up to a mean, an average emissions level would be hugely beneficial for the climate. And I think, that, among other conclusions from the report you'll hear about today, has implications for policymakers, because it makes clear that there's tremendous room to reduce emissions in much of the sector. And it's also very important for investors who can use this information, this sort of company-specific information, to determine which of their holdings have room to improve. As you'll also hear, the EPA data contains a lot of useful detail. So not only can investors see, sort of at a high level who the leaders and laggards are, but also why their emissions differ and what is sort of driving that delta from leaders to laggards. But of course, if you're here today, you'll also probably know that there's been a lot of focus in the last, year or two on the best approach to measuring methane emissions, and particularly the value and importance of measuring some emission sources directly and frequently, rather than using the emissions factors that the EPA database requires. And so one of the things that you'll be hearing about from our speakers today is both what the EPA data can tell us and what it doesn't. So, without additional delay, let's get to our speakers. So today you'll be hearing from representatives of all the groups that partnered on this report. First, you'll hear from Luke Hellgren with ERM, who will speak to the methodology behind the report. Then Lesley Feldman with Clean Air Task Force, which has been Ceres partner in this work since the beginning. We'll highlight some of the key findings. Finally, we'll go back to Luke, who will present really useful, at least in my view, online data tool, which allows you to generate essentially your own report based on the company's basins and sort of data slices that you're interested in. And we'll save ample time for questions, and ask that you submit them via the Q&A function at the bottom. Feel free to submit them as they occur to you, and then we'll gather and address them at the end of the formal presentations. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Luke to kick us off.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrew. So I think I'm going to first just go through the methodology, and then pass it to Lesley for some of the key findings. But if you can go to the next slide with regards to the methodology. So this is the third iteration of the report. So as is the case with benchmarking reports, kind of every iteration needs to use the same methodology to enable year-to-year apples to apples comparison. So this is the same as the previous two. The foundation of this analysis is really rooted in EPA's greenhouse gas reporting program data, and more specifically subpart W. So subpart W corresponds with 10 different segments associated with the oil and gas industry. We're focused exclusively on the onshore production segment. And a huge majority of the data in this analysis comes from that subpart W data set. So all the hydrocarbon data, all gas production, oil production comes from that. Huge majority, over 99% of the emissions data also come from that. The other less than 1% comes from another EPA data set that I'll talk about in a moment. So just a little more overview of GHGRP. There's a requirement for any facility in the country that emits over 25,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent annually to report emissions. Within the confines of subpart W, a facility is defined as a production-related facility is defined as any equipment or operations under common ownership that exists within a specific hydrocarbon producing basin. So any given facility may have a lot of different locations within a basin, a lot of different wells, a lot of equipment. But if it's under common ownership, company ownership, then it will be aggregated as one specific facility. So that ownership is defined, and we use this data set. It's defined by EPA's parent company data set that is released kind of in tandem with this subpart W data, and ultimately that aggregation is founded on that parent data set. So within subpart W, there are a lot of different emission sources. So this table corresponds with the 17 that are included, but again, there are a few others that are not included within GHGRP that we do account for on the following slide. So the other data set that we use is the greenhouse gas inventory, which is another EPA data set. Just a high level comparison of the two. GHGRP is a bottom up data set that doesn't necessarily cover the entire industry. It's only accounting for those companies that meet that 25,000 metric ton reporting threshold, and so is not comprehensive. It accounts for around 90% of hydrocarbon production, 75% of emissions, but it has very granular and detailed data. The greenhouse gas inventory, on the other hand, is a top-down analysis, a top-down data set that is comprehensive of the industry, but only provides summary level data, so not company level or basin level information. There are some emission factors that can be derived from the GHG inventory that can then be applied to activity data of companies from the GHGRP. And so this table kind of shows those 6 different sources that we're utilizing from the GHGI, and then incorporating it into some other activity data of the GHGRP to kind of create this as comprehensive of an emissions data set per company as we could. One note to make is when we kind of finalized data associated with this report, the most recent GHG inventory had not been released. And so we're using last year's GHGI inventory, our GHG inventory. So as you can see with the time series on this table, the factors don't change in a meaningful way, but it is just a note that we had to use last year's data, which corresponded with just a year delay. So going to the next slide, those 23 emission sources, is 17 from GHGRP and 6 from GHGI, were grouped into 5, just for the sake of this report, 5 different categories. So the first is process and equipment vented. So this is focused on almost exclusively methane emissions that are coming from just intentional releases of gas from equipment and processes. So this is largely from pneumatic devices, whether that's pneumatic controllers or pumps, and some well venting. Process and equipment flared is, instead of venting the emissions, this is flared emissions from captured gas from some of the same sources, but instead of just venting, it's combusted and flared, and so it's effectively all CO2. The associated gas vented and flared is specific to emissions that correspond with gas that's produced alongside oil. So this is gas that is kind of co-produced at oil wells, and may occur if companies don't have the equipment or infrastructure, or just choose to flare or vent, but they don't have the infrastructure to collect the gas for market, and it makes more sense for them just to either release it and vent it or flare it. Fugitive emissions correspond with unintentional releases. So this is all effectively methane as well, but this is coming from unintentional sources. So these are leaks or faulty equipment, old equipment, and corresponds with relatively small percentage of the total GHG emissions, but can often be improved via just equipment replacements. The last source is actually a very significant source. That's the other combustion. And so this is not really focused on any methane emissions. This is effectively all CO2 from combustion sources and largely just fossil fuel combustion on site, and largely from diesel and gas generators or engines that are used to power the equipment that's ultimately used to produce the oil and gas. So that other combustion segment or other combustion category varies a lot by basin, but just at a summary level is responsible for over a third of the greenhouse gas emissions of oil and gas production this year. So going to the last slide, this is focused on the intensity metrics that we're looking at and that we use to compare companies and basins. So the first is the methane intensity. So this is using the Natural Gas Sustainability Initiative protocol and the calculation for that intensity, which is really focused on trying to attribute methane emissions to gas production specifically. And so it kind of allocates or breaks down total methane emissions by the share of hydrocarbon production that it comes from natural gas. So this is trying to break out where the methane emissions are related to the gas sector versus just the oil and gas as a whole. GHG intensity is a little more straightforward. It's just taking the total CO2 equivalent of methane and N2O, and then just dividing it by the total hydrocarbon production. So that's the sum of produced gas and oil sales. So together, these are kind of the two that we consistently calculate across the industry for all the companies, all the basins, all the companies by basin. With that, I will pass it over to Lesley for some of the key findings.
Thanks, Luke. I'll walk through some of the key findings and conclusions from this year's report. Next slide. So the reported methane emissions intensity of natural gas production and the greenhouse gas emission intensity of oil and gas production varies dramatically across producers. And that's been a consistent finding that we've seen each time we've done this report. In this year's report, the highest emitting oil and gas companies had a reported methane emission intensity nearly 26 times that of the lowest emitting companies. And so the discrepancy between the high and low emitting companies is growing. And this emission intensity varies even between similarly sized operators in the same geographic area. And it seems to be largely due to different equipment choices and operational practices. Pneumatic controllers were the largest source of reported production segment methane emissions, making up nearly 2/3 of the total. And fuel combustion, as Luke was saying earlier, was the largest source of CO2 emissions. In addition, venting and flaring of associated gas are significant contributors in oil-heavy basins. Next slide. So on a CO2 equivalent basis and using the 100-year GWP, methane and CO2 emissions are roughly equivalent, but methane emissions would become even more significant if we were to use a 20-year GWP. The largest source of methane emissions are process and equipment venting, and that is dominated by pneumatic equipment, as you can see in the figure on the right. And the second largest source of reported methane emissions are fugitives. But we know that this reported data does not include abnormal process conditions or super emitters that we know comprises a significant quantity of total industry methane emissions. Next slide. I'll walk through at a high level some of the basin level results. So here are the basins ranked from highest to lowest oil and gas production. Some key insights: the Permian Basin has the highest production and also the highest total emissions. CO2 emissions from oil-heavy basins like the Permian and the Williston are particularly significant. And the San Juan Basin has disproportionately high methane emissions for its production level. Next slide. So here are those same basins in the same order, now showing a breakdown of the emission sources. You can see, for example, high levels of combustion and associated gas venting and flaring in the Permian and Williston basins. And next slide. So combining all that data, here are those same basins now presenting the two different emission intensities that Luke described earlier for each of the top basins. And you can see how the emissions intensities vary across basins. Next slide. Now I'll walk through at a high level some of the company level results. Next. So here are the 100 largest producers that you can see at the top chart, the hydrocarbon production, both oil and natural gas. And at the bottom, you can see the greenhouse gas emissions broken out by gas. Comparing this to the next slide, the next slide shows sort of a combination of that production data and the emissions data into the two different two different intensity metrics. You can see, as I was saying earlier, the wide variation in intensity across operators, with some standing out as particularly high and others low, but overall a wide variation. Next slide. So finally, I wanted to walk through some of the national trends. In this year's report, we, in addition to the 2021 data, we also collected the data going back to 2015 reports to the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program. You can see over the time series, oil and overall hydrocarbon production and natural gas production increased over the time period, and reported methane emissions declining, greenhouse gas emissions increasing, and then falling back to roughly baseline levels over the time period. And these trends are really interesting, and right now I'm showing the national level trends. In the report also has some details on particular trends for certain basins, which and different basins show somewhat different trends depending on the production activity in those basins. But I wanted to, on the next slide, I wanted to highlight some key points about that need to be considered when looking at this trend analysis. So the reported emission levels and the calculated emission intensity over the period 2015 to 2021 should be viewed in the context of the broader regulatory landscape in the US. We know that compliance with these regulations has led to significant methane reductions. For example, requirements for reduced emission completions have been driving down emissions from well completions and workovers. In addition, requirements to replace or prohibit new high bleed pneumatic controllers are leading to lower pneumatic controller emissions. and leak detection and repair requirements have led to lower fugitive emission rates. However, it is somewhat difficult to separate the impact of this regulatory compliance from other factors that are driving the data to change over time. For one example, as Luke was describing earlier, in the greenhouse gas reporting program, companies report total emissions in each basin that they operate. But in many cases, these basins don't fall neatly within one state. So if there are state level regulatory actions that are impacting those wells in a certain state, it's hard to tease out from the overall basin level data. Also, the current EPA regulations only apply to new and modified facilities. So it's not feasible to separate these new and modified facilities out from the existing facilities in the reported data. Also, as I was saying earlier, the greenhouse gas reporting program doesn't fully capture all fugitive emissions, particularly emissions from abnormal conditions and super emitters. LDAR programs will help to reduce those emissions, but that won't be fully captured in this reported data. We've also seen an increase in new and productive wells in many basins, and that often can lead to lower emissions intensities. And finally, many companies have embarked on voluntary emission reduction activities that can lead to lower emissions. But it's difficult to document and quantify these reductions and to separate the impacts of those voluntary actions from regulatory compliance actions. Next slide. So finally, I wanted to briefly touch on the expected impact of new and upcoming rulemakings. This obviously won't be seen in the current data, but we expect that a number of new laws and regulations will impact emissions going forward, and they'll have an impact on these reported methane emissions that we're seeing in the benchmarking report. Briefly, the EPA's supplemental proposal for its new and modified and also existing source guidelines for methane, we expect these to be finalized and companies to comply with those over the coming years, which will lead to significant emission reductions. And in 2022, Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which included the methane emission reduction program. And this gave EPA authority to establish a methane waste emission charge that operators would be required to pay if they exceed certain emission thresholds. And it also, as part of the MERC program, EPA will need to update its greenhouse gas reporting program to more fully include the empirical emission estimates. So we expect that the way the companies are reporting methane emissions to the greenhouse gas reporting program may change significantly over the coming years, and will have a significant impact on the reported emissions that we're seeing in this report. So thank you for your attention. And now I'll pass back to Luke for a demo of the online dashboard.
Thanks, Lesley. So let me share my screen. Okay. I first just wanted to start on sustainability.com webpage, which is where the link in the report directs you. So it sometimes might be a little tricky to get to the actual dashboards. Right now, the benchmarking report is on the main page, so that's an easy way to get there at the moment. In the future, it will have to go through the thinking page and then some filtering of different criteria. But for now, we'll just click straight on the main web page for this report. So this will take you to the landing page where you can download the report. You can download just Excel data that looks at company level information and company by basin level information. But the dashboards on this webpage, there are three main types of dashboards that all provide data that are within the report, but are much more interactive and are inclusive of historical data. So even though there are some trend slides within the reports, so 2015 through 2021, company level information back to 2015 are not available within the report. And so a lot of that information can be viewed through these dashboards. So the first one that I wanted to profile is the is focused on top 100 producers. So this is kind of the meat of the actual report. But again, goes back to 2015. So the first few tabs of each dashboard, or the first few tabs of this dashboard, are focused on those kind of the main criteria. So we have production and emissions associated with the top 100 producers. We have emissions by source, and we have the intensities associated with those producers. Within each dashboard, there is a little interactive. There are some features associated with them. One is just the fact that you can use your cursor and look at more detailed information associated with each feature with each company. You can toggle by year. This is showing 2021 data, but this can show 2015 through 2021. Also, you can change the GWP values that are applied for the emissions specifically. Right now, AR6 100-year timeframe is being applied, and that's what's applied in the report. But AR4 is available as well, because we acknowledge that AR4 is how EPA still expects companies to report. AR5 is excluded just because it's not really used anywhere anymore. And that's effectively the overview of this dashboard. One additional tab I wanted to point out is this additional top 100 rankings. These are essentially what's in the appendix of the report, and is looking at different metrics and the top 100 of those. So it's not tied to the top 100 producers, it's tied to just the top 100 within any specific metric. So there are a number of additional metrics that you can select and view the top 100 of. Moving down to the next dashboard, which is really focused on basin level information. First is just a basin overview for those production, emissions by source, and then the intensities. So this is just total production, total emissions at the basin level. Again, you can see more detailed information about the basin. If you put your cursor over the bars, you can change GWP values, just to show you kind of what this emissions by source looks like. This emissions by source shows the emissions breakdown by basin, and looks at it a few different ways. One is just the categories that we've defined, those 5 categories that we have condensed all of the GHGRP and GHGI sources into. But alternatively, you can view the emissions by GHGRP sources specifically. So those 17 sources, there are a lot more, so it's a little harder to view, especially with some of these small ones, but it is available. And then the non-GHGRP, which is effectively just the GHGI sources. Moving kind of through these tabs at the top, we can get into the company production by basin. And so this is breaking down that basin level data by company. And so right now we have Permian selected. So these are all the producers within the Permian in 2021. Again, can go through 2015. But you can find that basin level information with the cursor. And this is, again, set up the same way. So we have production and emissions at the basin level and at the company level, and then emissions by source. And then there's another tab over here that's the intensities associated with companies within each basin. So the last piece is company-wide data. So instead of breaking down company data by basin. This is company level data. So this is kind of the first just big overview of a company overview dashboard that provides a kind of a general overview and of each company's profile for any given year. Exxon's the #1 hydrocarbon producer, so that's just the default company. But any company that reports to the GHGRP is included in here, not just the top 100. So all 309 companies that reported in 2021, that number changes as you go to different years, but for every year, it's every company that reports to the GHGRP is included within this list. You can then go to the production and emissions tab of whatever specific company you're looking at. So this will show you all of the basin level information associated with that company, and the emissions at those that occur in those basins. Similar to the preceding dashboards, you can look at emissions by source, and the methane and GHG intensities by basin, and in this case by company as well. So that's kind of a similar template as the other dashboards, but just slicing the data in a little bit of a different way. The last two tabs on here are focused on comparing companies. So first we can compare companies just at the company level. So Exxon and Conoco are the two primary major hydrocarbon producers. So kind of the general metrics that are included in the report are shown here. And so emissions, hydrocarbon production, some of the intensity metrics. But you can also, in addition to this company level comparison, can compare companies within specific basins. So these are the two largest producers in the Permian, and you can select a number of different producers that can help inform just environmental performance across companies across basins. And so all of this, again, can go back to 2015 just to see how companies maybe have progressed or how changes have occurred at basins or on the basin level, or you can just really focus on the 2021 data. So that's there's a lot of data and a lot of different ways to view it, and hopefully this kind of provides the most meaningful ways to visualize and to digest everything. So that'll hand it back to Andrew, I believe.
Great. Yes. Thank you, Luke. And thank you, Lesley, as well, for the really interesting presentations. And I would just underscore, the real value that I found in the online tool. It really lets you sort of dive into, there's so much data here to sort of work with. It really lets you dive into, a specific company, a specific aspect of emissions, equipment types, basins. It's surprisingly fun to play around with. So definitely would recommend folks spend some time on that report, on that tool, as a way to sort of better understand some of the stories that these data are telling. So with that, we did reserve a fair amount of time for Q&A. So I would encourage folks to, I think the most efficient way here is just to put questions in the Q&A box, and we'll kind of get to those as they come in. While we're waiting for folks to do that, I have a couple of questions that I would want to ask of the group. One, and we sort of touched on this a little bit in the presentations, but there's obviously lots of discussion in the methane world around the limitations of some of this estimate-based or factor-based emissions data. So I'd love to hear from each of you, really, because you may have slightly different perspectives. I guess, given some of the concerns that have been raised about this data, what do you view, what can we actually draw from this data versus, what should we be a little bit more sort of cautious or skeptical about? And I guess a sort of related question is, Do you think the changes that EPA is moving toward in terms of the adjusting the emissions factors to be more empirically based, how much of that will close that gap, or is it really a different sort of issue we're talking about? So I don't know, Lesley, if you want to go first.
Sure. Yeah, good question. I think when you're looking at this data, there's a lot of value just in the amount of granular company-specific data that it has. There's as Luke was showing with the data tool, there's so many different ways you can cut and slice the data and get new insights. At the same time, it's important to keep in mind that the data isn't perfect. This is company reported data using emission factors and standard reporting methodologies that EPA has. There's a lot of value in that, and there's a lot of good science behind that, but it's not perfect. So whenever you're looking at that data, it's important to keep that in mind and to understand the limitations of that data. But despite that, I think there is still value in seeing how the data is reported, how the data varies across companies and across basins, because there are real insights that can be drawn there. And I think that as the EPA moves forward to revising its reporting methodology to more fully account for these empirical methods, that my hope is that that discrepancy will shrink, and that the data will become even more accurate and more robust. And I think NGOs and companies and the EPA all have an incentive to try to make sure it's moving in the right direction, so that we have a better picture of the emissions across the US. So I'm hopeful that it will go in that direction.
Yeah, I'd agree with all of that, and don't have much else to say. Maybe just reiterate the fact that the GHGRP provides, because it is standard reporting and everyone is reporting the exact same sources using the exact same factors, it's good just for comparison purposes, because everyone's starting kind of in the same place and it's an apples to apples comparison. But as Lesley's mentioned a lot, and it's totally true, there are a lot of issues with the data and underestimating certain sources, especially fugitive emissions. And there are also some factors that aren't necessarily maybe the correct one, or they're applied in interesting and maybe sometimes different ways by companies. There are also some boundaries within subpart W that have a little gray area with production, gathering, and boosting. Some companies might put some production equipment and gathering, boosting segment reporting, and vice versa. So there is some variance there, which causes some problems, but generally the value is that for the most part, it is it is the best apples to apples, or closest to apples comparison that exists publicly.
Great. Well, there's an excellent question in the Q&A, which I'll read out. So the question is does the EPA audit this company reported data? And if so, basically how and how often? And I guess that's a particularly interesting issue, both because there has been some reporting in the last year or so, like press reporting about companies making some questionable assumptions in their certain companies in certain instances. I don't think it's a widespread thing, but just perhaps gaming the system, or at least making some mistakes that really work in favor of their own footprint. But also, I guess as we move toward a future where this data sort of underpins or forms a basis for like the methane fee, all the more important, obviously, to get it right. And so, how does the EPA sort of assure the accuracy of this data?
Yeah, I can start. So companies are required to report the data once a year, and EPA does go through an audit process and internally, and there are ways that EPA can flag certain data as questionable and send things back to companies. In in certain EPA, EPA has their own data tool, the flight tool, and in that tool you can see which data has flags. But we decided in this report to use the data as is and not highlight those flags directly, partially because when EPA flags the data, they don't come out and say explicitly why the data was flagged or what the issue was. You know, if for people who are curious, you can find that data, you can find the flag from EPA, but you'd have to do a lot more digging to really understand why that data was flagged. And Luke can talk a little bit more to this. When we collected this data, we shared the data with all the companies and gave them the opportunity to correct anything or just to verify the data was accurate. Luke, do you want to talk a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So right, the data that are reported to GHGRP, we use that as they are, but we do send kind of the summary data reports to companies for review, and in some cases, companies do have changes to that to their data that they will be filing with EPA and resubmitting data for the next year's release that will retroactively correct this year's data set for them. And so, you know, that data set, just to maybe give an idea of the timeline, GHGRP is usually released in October of the for the data year of the preceding. The data year is the preceding year. And when companies resubmit, so like in this case, the 2023 GHGRP in October, any resubmissions for 2021 data year will be updated within the 2023 GHGRP as well as the 2022 new data. So it'll correspond with like an update to 2 data years. And so the company review process that we go through kind of tries to incorporate the data that companies will be submitting with EPA for that update in the coming months.
Great, thank you. And I would only add, I mean, right now, in fact, I think the comment period closes tomorrow. The EPA has asked for, you know, public feedback on a series of questions around the methane fee, and I think part of that is an attempt to really, I think, figure out how best to use the resources that the Inflation Reduction Act has allocated for, you know, for the methane fee, some of which I think can be used for enforcement and assurance. But I guess we will see kind of where that lands when the final rules come out over the next few months. So we have a bunch of questions in the Q&A. I'll just sort of go through them in order. The first is you know, asks how do periodic and continuous monitoring, so how does direct monitoring of methane emissions impact emissions reported on an attribution factor basis? So maybe even broadening that out a bit, you know, again, as we see companies moving more toward at least some direct and, you know, continuous or near continuous monitoring a part to their operations, you know, will that affect what they report to EPA? Or are we in essence going to have 2 sets of books for methane emissions, you know, as we go forward?
I guess in the current reporting framework, that monitoring data wouldn't directly, I mean, it could be incorporated in some ways, but it wouldn't have a direct impact on what companies have to report. But like we were saying earlier, EPA is in this process right now, and they're required to update the reporting methodology to more fully and accurately take into account those empirical observations. So those measurements of methane emissions will start to inform companies' reported data in the coming years.
Great. Here is another excellent high-level question about sort of the use of the data. So how do you see the benchmarking process helping to identify areas for improvement and drive oil and natural gas production industry-wide sustainability initiatives? So essentially, how can companies use this data to drive progress? Yeah,
I think one of the key ways is to see the specific sources of emissions and to see where some companies have higher emissions than their peers in the same basin or of the same size. It will draw attention to potentially high emission sources. And this data, even though there's a lot of data here, it's also in some ways just a starting point. It gives you hints about where the emissions are and what the problems are, but they're to really understand what actions need to be taken to reduce those emissions, you need to go a step further and understand, what's happening on the ground, which with each, at the specific well sites and operations. So we hope that this data will be a starting point to highlight the areas of problems and to spark further investigation.
Luke, anything you would add on that one?
No, I think that's pretty much what I was thinking.
Great. So a few more questions. One I would just throw into the mix is just, Luke, to the question of, or the issue of sort of how do you define intensity? There's been some discussion in our world, at least recently, around the question of, do you assign methane intensity only to natural gas production, or do you assign it to the whole suite of products that are coming out of a single well? And that can really change the intensity of some basins, right? That are where gas is more of a byproduct, or where it's a wet gas, environment. And so, I guess I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on that broad question, but also, how much of the difference that we see in basins in the report do you think is driven by the issue of whether they are gas focused basins versus, associated gas basins?
Yeah, so I think in general, there is a relationship between what type of basin it is with regards to the intensities. A lot of the gas basins have much lower methane intensities. To your question about changing the methane intensity or like calculating it based on just total methane associated with all operations, like both oil and gas production. I mean, that's a different way of looking at it. I think this just kind of how this project and this analysis started was trying to focus more on natural gas production, and that corresponded with utilization of the NGSI factor, which is really just focused on gas production. And things have changed in the past few years, and there's a lot more associated gas. So I think that it's a fair question and a fair potential incorporation or addition in the future, but that's kind of maybe the general reason why it has just not made it here. I think one, the GHG intensity was the kind of total hydrocarbon intensity metric that we wanted to include, so we wouldn't be totally ignoring the oil component of everything.
And I would just add that on this question of attribution of emissions to oil versus gas, it really depends on what the goal is of your analysis. Like, are you specifically looking at the natural gas supply chain and the supply chain of just what is happening with the natural gas, or are you thinking more holistically about the oil and gas industry, in which case you wouldn't want to attribute it to just the gas. So it really depends on what the purpose of that analysis is. And I would also add that for the methane fee as part of the methane emission reduction program, I think they still haven't clearly defined what the equation will be for the intensity, and I think that will be forthcoming. And it might not look exactly like our methane intensity, and it certainly won't be the greenhouse gas intensity, because that includes CO2 as well. So once we see that, if we we have a note about this in the report, if we see that EPA defines a certain intensity in future versions of this report, we might incorporate that specific equation so that it's more comparable apples to apples with what companies are required to do for that regulation. You're muted, Andrew.
Sorry, we have a couple of questions left. We're sort of up on time, but I'll try to ask a couple of them, sort of combine them. They're really questions around like boundaries on the data. So the first is whether emissions data and the production data that we use are those based on operated production and emissions or equity based, which is a big issue right now, obviously in the oil and gas emissions reporting space. And then secondly, do we include any? Does the data include any emissions from wastewater, which is interesting. So or the processing of wastewater, which again is a growing issue certainly in the Permian, but lots of other places as well. So that Luke may be a question for you or for Darren, perhaps.
So for the data boundary, it's based on equity ownership, and the starting point for that is EPA's parent data set that they attribute provide a parent company associated with every facility, and then the ownership share of that parent. So, we allocate emissions and production based on that ownership share. For the production segment, there are very few jointly owned facilities. For the wastewater piece, I don't know if it's explicitly called out in any of the emission sources, but it may indirectly be captured within the other combustion sources if like equipment's being like, I guess I'm not familiar with wastewater treatment operations, but I would assume that just the other combustion, so different generators that are being used to treat that water would account for it, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, and hi everyone, this is Darren Schroeder with Clean Air Task Force. It's a good question, and I don't know if I have the answer. I think often the wastewater treatment, like those are held in storage tanks, so sometimes it can be seen in the data from that. Those, the EPA standards, like Section 111 rules that Lesley had referenced earlier, those don't really address the wastewater storage tanks because the VOC and methane emissions are lower than kind of the throughput vessels. But my guess is that some of the wastewater emissions are reflected in the storage vessel and storage tank categories.
Great. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time for Q&A. Those were some really excellent questions. There's one left in the chat about carbon capture. It's a bit out of scope, but I would just say Clean Air Task Force has deep expertise on carbon capture, and I'm sure can help you out with an answer to that question. So with that, I will thank you for the questions and the helpful answers, and just move to, I think, to start wrapping things up and just try to summarize a little bit of what we've heard. We're at a really interesting and critical moment in both global and U.S. efforts to address methane. As you heard, the U.S. EPA is moving forward towards a final rule. It sounds like in November. We have the methane fee that is being sort of developed and given some structure around how it's going to be implemented. I think with all that happening, and with the hopefully imminent availability of more publicly available direct measurement data from satellites and other sources, it's really a time that, I think for all of us collectively, investors, NGOs, companies, to continue moving forward with urgency, both to improve our understanding of methane emissions and address them in as near real time as we can. And as you heard today, more than once, the data show pretty clearly that there is, on the one hand, both lots of existing leadership from parts of the industry, as well as considerable room for many companies to up their game. So with that, I think we have a few housekeeping slides. Angelina, is that right? Just to give folks a sense of what's coming next on the Ceres front. And then also someone did ask about the slide deck, which we will share after the call, along with some other resources. So if you didn't furiously take notes on the call, no need. We will get that to anyone who registered. not long after the call. So just a few quick things from Ceres end. One is just to highlight our Freedom to Invest initiative, which we certainly invite companies and investors on this call to read and sign on to. So you can check out the link or scan the QR code for that. Another initiative we have on the next slide is a course that we've launched with the business school at the University of Michigan that is focused on building corporate director capacity around sustainability and fiduciary duty. And then finally, we want to highlight our Evening with Ceres, which is coming up in October in San Francisco on the 16th. So feel free to visit the link here for more information. And then very finally, before we let you all go, encourage you to fill out the survey, let us know how we did and how we can improve for future webinars. So with that, I will let everyone go and thank you again, and encourage you both to read the report, but again, to check out the online tool that Luke highlighted at sustainability.com. So with that, I will thank you all and say take care.